You wake up, you check your phone, you already feel behind. There's an inbox to clear, a commute to survive, a list of tasks longer than the hours you have to do them in. You tell yourself this is just what being human means. Work, struggle, repeat. But the real answer is far stranger. For most of the time humans have existed on this planet, a normal Tuesday looked nothing like yours. No alarm clock, no inbox, no grinding 9 to 5 just to stay alive. In fact, for a huge stretch of human history, people worked less than you do right now. Sometimes a lot less. That sounds impossible, doesn't it? You've probably pictured prehistoric life as a nonstop scramble, chasing food, fleeing predators, barely surviving from one meal to the next. Hollywood loves that image. Grunting cavemen, dragging clubs, starving half the year. It's a good story. It's just not a true one. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Richard Lee decided to actually test the idea. He didn't guess. He didn't theorize from an armchair. He went and lived with the Juhwansi people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, a community who still hunted and gathered much of their food at the time. He wanted a real number. How many hours does it actually take to feed yourself if you're not farming, not stockpiling, not building an economy? Just gathering what the land gives you. His findings shocked the field. Adults in the group he studied spent around 15 hours a week securing food. 15 hours, not 50, not 60, 15. The rest of the time? Rest, storytelling, visiting relatives, naps in the shade, long stretches of nothing in particular. Lee published his data in 1968 at a symposium that would later be nicknamed Man the Hunter, and it planted a seed that would grow into one of anthropology's most disruptive ideas. That same year, an anthropologist named Marshall Solins looked at Lee's numbers and data from other foraging societies and drew a conclusion that broke the story we'd been telling ourselves for centuries. He called it the original affluent society. Not affluent because people had more stuff. The opposite, actually. Foraging groups often owned almost nothing. A few tools, a blanket, something to carry water in. Affluent because their wants were small and easily met. You don't need a mortgage if you don't believe in owning land. You don't need a savings account if the land renews itself every season, and your neighbors will feed you if you're ever short. Solins argued something radical. That scarcity isn't a fact of nature. It's a relationship between what you want and what you have. And societies that want very little can feel wealthier than societies that have very much. Sit with that for a second. Because it flips the whole story on its head, doesn't it? We tend to imagine progress as a straight line. Hard, brutal, hungry past. Comfortable, secure, abundant present. Work more now, work less later. Once technology finally catches up. But if Lee and Solins were right, work didn't decrease as humans developed. In many ways, it increased. So what actually happened? If ancient humans weren't fighting for survival every waking hour, what were they doing with their days? Mostly, they were doing what you'd probably call a normal life. Just organized completely differently. Mornings might start slow. No clock demanding punctuality. People woke roughly with the light, checked in with each other, decided together what the day needed. Some days meant a hunting trip which could take hours and sometimes came back empty-handed. Other days meant gathering, digging for tubers, collecting nuts, tracking which plants were fruiting nearby. Children tagged along and learned by watching, not by sitting through lessons. But a huge portion of daily life wasn't labor at all. It was maintenance of relationships, long conversations, arguments settled through group discussion rather than formal law, music, dancing around a fire that had nothing to do with productivity and everything to do with connection. A researcher named Jerome Siegel led a study in 2015 that placed sleep monitors on members of 3 modern foraging and hunting societies who still live largely without electricity: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Semane of Bolivia. The assumption going in was that these groups, closer to how humans lived for most of history, would sleep more than modern people, probably falling asleep right at sundown. The data said otherwise. They slept on average about the same amount as people in industrialized countries, sometimes even less. But they almost never reported insomnia. Their sleep, however long it lasted, was deep and largely uninterrupted by the anxious, wired wakefulness so common in modern life. Why? Temperature seemed to matter more than darkness. Their bodies cooled naturally as night fell, since there was no artificial heating trapping warmth indoors. Their sleep followed their body's internal signals instead of an alarm clock forcing them awake against their own rhythm. In other words, it wasn't more sleep that made the difference. It was less conflict between the body and the schedule. Doesn't that sound familiar? How many nights have you lain awake, exhausted, phone glowing in the dark, mind racing about tomorrow's obligations? So if ancient humans weren't overworked and weren't sleep-deprived, what changed? Where did all this modern exhaustion actually come from? The shift traces back roughly 10,000 years to the invention of agriculture. It sounds like a triumph. Permanent settlements, stored grain, larger, more secure communities. But it also introduced something foraging life rarely required: constant, scheduled labor. Fields don't tend themselves. Grain doesn't harvest itself before the weather turns. Suddenly, human bodies were yoked to the rhythm of crops instead of the rhythm of their own energy. Ownership entered the picture too. Land could now belong to someone. Surplus could be hoarded, taxed, fought over. And where there's surplus to protect, hierarchy tends to follow. Chiefs, kings, debts, wages. The story of civilization is often told as a story of progress. More food, more people, more stability, all true. But it came paired with something less often mentioned: more hours spent working just to keep the system running. By the time industrialization arrived, centuries later, humans weren't working to feed themselves directly anymore. They were working to earn currency, which they'd then exchange for food someone else had grown, in a chain so long, most people never see where their meal actually came from. The connection between effort and reward, once immediate and visible in a day of gathering, became abstract, diffuse, easy to lose sight of, buried under deadlines and quotas set by people you'll never meet. And here's the modern mirror. You might tell yourself you're free, no chief, no king. You choose your job. You choose your schedule, technically. But look at how much of your day is still organized around producing something for someone else's benefit. Look at how rare true, unstructured time has become. Time with no goal attached to it at all. Foraging life wasn't perfect. It carried real risks. Modern life mostly protects you from illness without medicine, unpredictable food years, small group conflicts with no larger authority to intervene. Nobody's arguing you should trade your life for theirs. But the myth that ancient humans were locked in constant, desperate labor and that modern humans finally escaped into leisure doesn't hold up against the data. If anything, the opposite pattern shows up again and again in the research. The 15 hours Richard Lee measured weren't an anomaly. Similar patterns turned up in study after study of other foraging societies across different continents, different climates, different cultures, with no contact with one another. That consistency is what made Solons take the idea seriously enough to name it